September 4th, 1944, witnessed one of the most deceptive triumphs in the history of World War II as Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General Dwight D. Eisenhower celebrated the fall of Antwerp. This massive Belgian port offered the ultimate prize for a starving Allied supply line. Yet a singular strategic oversight by the High Command turned this victory into a hollow shell. Why did the most seasoned generals of the Western Front ignore the coastal waters that held the key to Germany's heartland? The rapid collapse of the German front in France during the late summer of 1944 created an atmosphere of near invincibility within the Allied High Command. Following the breakout from Normandy, British and American armored columns raced across the European plains with a speed that defied logistical logic. By early September, the British 11th Armored Division surged into the city of Antwerp, capturing its vast docks and intricate machinery almost entirely intact. This was a miraculous feat of arms, as the German defenders had failed to trigger the demolition charges that would have rendered the harbor useless for years. To the soldiers on the ground and the public at home, it appeared that the back of the Wehrmacht was finally broken and the road to Berlin lay wide open. However, a map is a dangerous tool when read with overconfidence, and Field Marshal Montgomery was currently fixated on a singular point further north. While the city of Antwerp was officially liberated, the port itself was situated nearly 80 kilometers inland from the North Sea, connected only by the winding waters of the Scheldt estuary. As long as the German 15th Army controlled the banks of this waterway and the fortified island of Walcheren, not a single Allied cargo ship could reach the docks. Montgomery viewed the capture of the city as the end of the mission, rather than the beginning of a complex naval clearing operation. He believed that the momentum of the pursuit would naturally force a German collapse, rendering the maritime geography irrelevant in the face of his planned lightning strike across the Rhine. The warning signs were immediate and came from the highest levels of naval command, yet they fell on ears deafened by the roar of advancing tanks. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the first Sea Lord, and Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the Allied naval commander, both recognized the unfolding catastrophe with haunting clarity. They understood a fundamental truth of mechanized warfare that Montgomery chose to overlook. A port is only as valuable as the water leading into it. Cunningham famously remarked that the army had seized the key but lacked the sense to open the door. Yet his pleas to prioritize the clearing of the Scheldt were pushed aside. Montgomery was already deep into the planning of Operation Market Garden, a daring airborne gamble that he believed would end the war by Christmas, provided he received every drop of available fuel and every crate of ammunition. This prioritization of a narrow northern thrust meant that the German 15th Army, which should have been trapped against the coast, was instead given a golden bridge to safety. General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, commanding the battered but still functional 15th Army, realized that the Allied failure to seize the Bevelin Peninsula was a gift from the heavens. While Montgomery's eyes were fixed on the bridges at Arnhem, von Zangen organized a massive ferrying operation across the Scheldt. Under the cover of autumn mists and nighttime darkness, over 80,000 German soldiers, hundreds of artillery pieces, and thousands of vehicles were evacuated from the pocket. These were not defeated men. They were veterans who would live to fight another day, manning the very defenses the Allies would later have to storm at a horrific cost. The tension at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, reached a boiling point as the logistical reality began to settle in like a cold winter fog. General Dwight D. Eisenhower found himself in a diplomatic and strategic vice, caught between the soaring ego of Montgomery and the frantic demands of his logistical officers. The Allied supply lines still stretched all the way back to the artificial Mulberry harbors in Normandy and the wrecked port of Cherbourg, hundreds of miles to the rear. Every gallon of gasoline delivered to the front consumed another gallon just to transport it there, creating a diminishing return that threatened to bring the entire Allied machine to a grinding halt. Eisenhower knew that Antwerp was the only solution to this strangulation, yet he hesitated to overrule Montgomery's desire for one last glorious left hook into Germany. By mid-September, the strategic mistake transitioned from a missed opportunity into a full-scale crisis as Operation Market Garden drew all resources away from the coast. The heavy guns of the German 15th Army were now firmly established on the island of Walcheren, creating a lethal gauntlet for any Allied vessel attempting to enter the Scheldt. The terrain was a nightmare of reclaimed land, flooded polders, and narrow dikes that favored the defender in every possible way. While the world watched the skies over Holland for paratroopers, the 1st Canadian Army was quietly ordered to deal with the mess Montgomery had left behind. General Guy Simonds, the acting commander of the Canadian forces, looked at the maps with a grim understanding that his men were being asked to fight a battle that should never have been necessary. The geography of the Scheldt was a labyrinth of death, where the distinction between land and sea blurred into a gray horizon of cold water. The German defenders had spent years fortifying these positions as part of the Atlantic Wall, and they now utilized the natural flooding of the region to create impasse. Any advance required moving along the tops of exposed dikes, where German MG-42 machine guns and 88mm flak guns could sweep the horizon with surgical precision. The Canadian soldiers, alongside units from the British 52nd Lowland Division, found themselves wading through waist-deep water, carrying their equipment over their heads while snipers picked them off from hidden bunkers. This was the forgotten war of 1944, a grueling slog necessitated by a refusal to coordinate at the highest levels of command. As the failure of Market Garden became apparent in the final days of September, the true weight of the Antwerp mistake crashed down upon the Allied leadership. The bridges at Arnhem remained in German hands. The Rhine was not crossed, and the supply crisis had reached a state of absolute paralysis. General Patton's Third Army to the south was literally running out of food and fuel, while Montgomery's 21st Army Group was bogged down in the Dutch marshes. The broad front strategy that Eisenhower favored was now a broken line of static units, all because the great port of Antwerp sat idle, its cranes motionless and its warehouses empty. The German 15th Army, once thought to be a non-factor, was now firmly entrenched and ready to defend the Scheldt to the last man. The psychological landscape of the German high command shifted from panic to a renewed sense of purpose during this critical reprieve. Hitler and his generals realized that as long as Antwerp remained closed, the Allies could not launch a sustained invasion of the German heartland. They utilized every hour of the delay to reinforce the West Wall and prepare for the counteroffensive that would eventually become the Battle of the Bulge. The reprieve granted by Montgomery's refusal to coordinate allowed the Wehrmacht to rebuild its shattered divisions and stockpile the very resources the Allies were currently lacking. It was a masterclass in how a tactical victory, like the capture of a city, can become a strategic defeat when the logistics are ignored. The role of General Guy Simonds during this period cannot be overstated, as he was forced to develop innovative and desperate tactics to crack the German nut. Recognizing that a frontal assault on the dikes was a recipe for suicide, Simonds proposed a radical plan. He would use the Royal Air Force to bomb the dikes and flood the island of Walcheren itself. This would turn the German defensive positions into isolated islands, allowing for an amphibious assault that could bypass the most heavily fortified lines. It was a brutal necessity that reflected the desperation of the hour, a decision that would devastate the local civilian population, but was seen as the only way to break the deadlock that the High Command had created. Meanwhile, the relationship between Montgomery and his naval counterparts deteriorated into open hostility and mutual resentment. Admiral Ramsay continued to produce reports showing that the Allied advance would stall by October without the Scheldt, yet Montgomery dismissed these as naval pessimism. The Field Marshal remained convinced that his genius for maneuver would overcome any lack of supplies, a belief that bordered on the delusional as winter approached. The lack of a unified command structure for the maritime and land forces meant that there was no one to force a reconciliation of these conflicting priorities until it was far too late. The Canadian soldiers who bore the brunt of this failure were often operating with limited artillery support and virtually no tank cover, as the mud swallowed anything with wheels or tracks. The Battle of the Scheldt was becoming one of the most casualty-intensive operations of the entire war in the West. Every meter of progress was paid for in blood, as men fought for small patches of dry ground that offered no cover from the relentless rain and German mortar fire. This was a war of attrition in its purest form, a far cry from the sweeping armored dashes of August, and it served as a bitter reminder of the consequences of strategic neglect. In the rear areas, the logistical officers were performing miracles of improvisation, yet they were fighting a losing battle against the laws of physics. They began the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, but even this could not compensate for the lack of a major deep-water port. The Allied armies were essentially living hand-to-mouth, with commanders forced to choose between feeding their troops or fueling their tanks. This scarcity dictated the pace of the war, allowing the German defenders to dictate the terms of engagement for the first time since the D-Day landings. By the end of September 1944, the tragedy was fully set in stone as the autumn rains began to turn the European theater into a morass of sludge. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 had slipped through the fingers of the Allied generals, not because of a lack of courage from their troops, but because of a failure of vision at the top. The capture of Antwerp remained a brilliant tactical success on paper, but in reality, it was a ghost port, haunted by the ships that could not enter and the supplies that could not be delivered. The transition into October 1944 brought a harsh realization to the Allied command, as the Scheldt problem could no longer be ignored or sidelined. The failure of Market Garden had left Montgomery's reputation tarnished and his armies overextended, forcing a reluctant pivot toward the very task he had previously dismissed as a distraction. The 1st Canadian Army was now officially tasked with the liberation of the Scheldt, but they were facing a German defense that had used the month of September to become almost impregnable. General Guy Simons launched Operation Switchback with the goal of clearing the Breskens Pocket, a heavily defended area on the southern bank of the estuary. The combat here was unlike anything seen in the hedgerows of Normandy. It was a prehistoric struggle in a flooded landscape where the only dry ground was the tops of the dikes. Canadian infantrymen had to cross the Leopold Canal under a hail of fire, using flamethrowers to clear the concrete bunkers that lined the banks. The German 64th Infantry Division, composed of seasoned veterans and well-equipped recruits, fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that they were the last barrier protecting the heart of the Reich's supply denial strategy. The sheer scale of the logistical failure became evident as the Canadian casualty list began to mount with frightening speed. Thousands of men were being lost not in a grand offensive toward Berlin, but in a secondary theater that should have been secured weeks earlier. The psychological strain on the troops was immense, as they felt like the forgotten army, fighting in the shadows while the world's attention remained on the more glamorous sectors held by the Americans and the British. Every day the Scheldt remained closed was another day that the German army could reinforce the West Wall, making the eventual crossing of the Rhine even more deadly. On the northern bank, the Bevelin Peninsula presented another set of challenges, as it was connected to the mainland by only a narrow neck of land. The Canadians had to fight their way through a series of interlocking defensive lines, often moving through water that was contaminated by sewage and the debris of war. Disease, specifically trench foot and exhaustion, began to take as many men out of the line as German bullets did. Montgomery, still largely removed from the tactical horrors of the estuary, continued to press for speed, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his previous delays had made speed a physical impossibility in this terrain. The climax of the campaign focused on the island of Walcheren, which Admiral Ramsay described as the cork in the bottle. This island was essentially a massive fortress ringed with heavy coastal batteries that could sink any Allied ship within miles. Simon's plan to breach the dikes was finally authorized, and on October 3rd, the RAF sent 243 heavy bombers to strike the Westkapelle dike. The sea rushed in, drowning the German inland defenses and turning the island into a series of scattered strongpoints. While this was a tactical masterstroke, it was also a humanitarian disaster for the Dutch civilians, a cost that weighed heavily on the conscience of the Allied planners, who knew this could have been avoided by a timely capture in September. The amphibious assault on Walcheren, known as Operation Infatuate, was one of the most complex and dangerous operations of the war. British commandos and Canadian troops landed in small craft, struggling against the incoming tide and the fierce resistance of the German gunners. The bravery displayed by the landing parties was legendary, but it was a bravery born of necessity. As the commandos fought house to house in the flooded streets of Middelburg, the high command at Scheldt was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of their earlier mistake. The broad front was starving, and the blood being spilled on Walcheren was the price of the fuel needed to move it forward. By November 8, 1944, the last German resistance in the Scheldt was finally crushed, but the victory was bittersweet. The 1st Canadian Army had suffered nearly 13,000 casualties in just a few weeks of fighting. The waterway was finally clear of enemy troops, but it was not yet open to shipping. The Germans had sown the estuary with thousands of naval mines of every conceivable type, magnetic, acoustic, and pressure-sensitive. This created a new kind of war, one fought by mine-sweeping crews who had to painstakingly clear a path for the supply ships while still under the threat of sporadic German long-range fire. The delay in opening Antwerp had a direct and catastrophic impact on the events of December 1944. Because the Allied armies were so undersupplied and their lines so thin, Hitler saw an opportunity to launch the Ardennes offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. If the port of Antwerp had been open in October, the Allied divisions would have been far better equipped, reinforced, and positioned to detect and crush the German buildup. Instead, the shortage of fuel and ammunition meant that the Allies were off balance and vulnerable, leading to one of the bloodiest periods for American forces in the entire war. When the first Allied supply ship, the Canadian freighter Fort Cataraqui, finally docked in Antwerp on November 28th, it was nearly 3 months after the city's liberation. The sight of the massive vessel being unloaded was a moment of immense relief for the logistical corps, but for many, it was a reminder of what might have been. The 3-month delay had effectively extended the war in Europe by at least half a year, causing countless deaths and prolonged suffering for the millions of people still under Nazi occupation in the Netherlands and beyond. Field Marshal Montgomery's refusal to prioritize the Scheldt remains a centerpiece of military debate regarding the ego and the limitations of high command. While he was a master of the set-piece battle, his tunnel vision and desire for the glory of a final northern thrust blinded him to the mechanical realities of modern war. General Eisenhower's role is also scrutinized. His failure to firmly command Montgomery to clear the riverbanks in early September is seen by many historians as a rare moment of indecision from the Supreme Commander. The lack of coordination between the land and naval branches during this period is a classic case study in how divided command structures can lead to catastrophic strategic paralysis. The Canadian contribution to the war effort reached its zenith in the mud of the Scheldt, yet it remains one of the less discussed campaigns in popular history. These men fought in conditions that mirrored the worst of the First World War, yet they did so with a professional efficiency that broke the back of the German 15th Army. The sacrifice of the 1st Canadian Army ensured that the Allies would finally have the logistics necessary to launch the final invasion of Germany in 1945, but they paid a price that was disproportionate to the strategic goals. Had they been handled correctly from the start? Reflecting on the memoirs of the soldiers who were there, a common theme emerges, a sense of frustration at the brass who didn't seem to understand the water and the mud. A Canadian private from the Black Watch Regiment wrote in his diary that they were fighting for puddles while the generals were looking at stars. This disconnect between the strategic map and the tactical reality is the defining characteristic of the Antwerp delay. It serves as a reminder that in war, the most direct path to the enemy's capital is rarely found on a straight line, but rather through the reliable flow of bread, bullets, and gasoline. The German perspective on this period is equally telling. General von Zangen's reports to Berlin expressed a mix of bewilderment and gratitude for the Allied hesitation. The Wehrmacht had expected to be destroyed in early September, yet they found themselves given the time to construct a formidable defense that cost the Allies months of progress. This reprieve allowed the German industry, despite the constant Allied bombing, to produce one final surge of weaponry and used to devastating effect in the winter of 1944. As the war finally drew to a close in May 1945, the lessons of the Scheldt were integrated into military doctrine. The importance of joint operations, the seamless coordination between land, sea, and air forces, became the gold standard for future military planning. The failure at Antwerp proved that a commander who ignores the maritime and logistical flank does so at his own peril. The silent cranes of Antwerp in the autumn of 1944 stood as a monument to the high cost of a single, narrow-minded strategic mistake. Ultimately, the capture of Antwerp and the subsequent delay in clearing the Scheldt is a story of human fallibility at the highest level. It is a narrative of how ego can cloud judgment, how logistics can dictate destiny, and how the bravery of the common soldier is often the only thing that can rectify the errors of the great generals. Field Marshal Montgomery and General Eisenhower led the Allies to victory, but the mud of the Scheldt remains a stain on the record of an otherwise brilliant campaign. A reminder that in the theater of war, every detail counts, and the most boring details, like a winding river or a mud-clogged dike, are often the ones that matter most. Do you believe Field Marshal Montgomery's focus on Operation Market Garden was a justified gamble to end the war quickly? Or was it an unforgivable neglect of the logistical reality at Antwerp? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.